July 21, 1944. The verdant forests near Saint-Lô, Normandy. Dawn light filtered through the dense canopy as Obersturmführer Klaus Müller of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend stood beside his Tiger tank, its massive 8.8-centimeter cannon aimed at an American vehicle carcass 200 meters distant. The dew-covered grass dampened his polished boots as he smiled confidently at the assembled crew. They were about to demonstrate the superiority of German engineering over captured American weapons. Little did they know that this demonstration would fundamentally alter their perception of the battlefield and their chances of survival. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how elite German panzer crews, indoctrinated to believe in their technological invincibility, came face to face with a simple truth that would shatter their worldview. The American military had placed in the hands of ordinary infantrymen the power to destroy the most feared tanks in the European theater. "Gather around, comrades," Müller called to the assembled men of his company. 23 tank commanders and their gunners formed a semicircle around a wooden table where several tube-shaped objects lay under a canvas tarp. The morning air carried the scent of pine and diesel fuel as birds chirped obliviously to the deadly business at hand. "Our intelligence officers have recovered several of these new American weapons from the battlefield," Müller announced, pulling away the tarp to reveal 3 olive-drab-colored tubes with curious sighting mechanisms attached. "They call it the bazooka. Our high command wants us to understand what we're facing, so we're going to test them ourselves against one of our disabled Panthers." Standing to Müller's right, Hauptscharführer Werner Schmidt, a veteran tank commander with 3 years on the Eastern Front, scoffed audibly. "Another American toy. They think they can stop German steel with these tubes." Several men laughed. But Müller noticed that Unterscharführer Heinrich Brandt, his most experienced gunner, remained silent, studying the weapons with narrowed eyes. "We will see," Müller replied diplomatically. "Brandt, you've studied the intelligence reports. Explain how these bazookas function." Brandt stepped forward, his weathered face serious beneath his field cap. At 34, he was older than most of the assembled men, many of whom were fresh-faced recruits from the Hitler Youth who had earned their nickname Baby Division from both Allies and Wehrmacht veterans alike. "The Americans call it the M1 bazooka," Brandt began, lifting one of the tubes. "It's a shoulder-fired recoilless anti-tank weapon that fires a rocket-propelled shaped charge. According to prisoners, they've been distributing these to regular infantry units since early 1943. Schmidt interjected, "So now every American farm boy thinks he can be a tank killer." "Absurd." Müller raised a hand to silence him. "Let's see what these weapons can actually do before we dismiss them. Brandt, you've studied the captured manual. You will demonstrate." The company moved to a prepared position where a damaged Panther tank sat 100 meters away. The once proud vehicle had struck a mine 3 days earlier, destroying its left track assembly, but its armor remained intact, making it perfect for this demonstration. Brandt knelt and carefully examined the bazooka, loading a rocket into the rear of the tube. The assembled officers watched with a mixture of curiosity and derision. These men had commanded the most advanced tanks in the world, machines that had terrorized Europe for years. The idea that a simple tube carried by infantry could threaten them seemed laughable. "According to the manual, effective range is about 120 meters, Brandt explained as he shouldered the weapon. "The rocket carries a shaped charge designed to focus explosive energy in one direction." "Shaped charges aren't new," Schmidt commented dismissively. "Our intelligence says American armor penetration is inferior to our Panzerfaust." "That may be true," Brandt replied, "but unlike our Panzerfaust, this is reusable and can be fired repeatedly. And apparently, they've manufactured hundreds of thousands of them." This statement caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Several officers exchanged glances. The German Panzerfaust was indeed a formidable anti-tank weapon, but it was single-use and more complex to operate effectively. "Proceed with the demonstration," Müller ordered. Brandt took position, aiming the bazooka at the side armor of the Panther. The men stepped back, some covering their ears. When Brandt pulled the trigger, the backblast erupted behind him as the rocket launched with a distinctive whooshing sound that none of them had heard before. The rocket streaked toward the Panther and struck its side armor with a sharp crack. Smoke billowed from the point of impact, and when it cleared, the officers moved forward to examine the results. "Look at this," Müller said, his voice betraying surprise as he pointed to a neat hole in the side armor. The rocket penetrated nearly 40 millimeters of steel. Schmidt pushed forward to see for himself. "This is a damaged tank. The armor integrity was already compromised." "No," Brandt countered. "I aimed at an undamaged section. This penetration is consistent with what intelligence reported." A younger officer, Untersturmführer Josef Weber, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "The side armor of our Tigers is only 80 millimeters. If this weapon can penetrate 40 millimeters at 100 meters, it means the Americans have a weapon that can threaten our tanks from the side." Müller completed the thought. "But let's not overreact. The front armor of a Tiger is 100 millimeters. No bazooka could penetrate that." Brandt looked thoughtful. "Perhaps we should test it against a Tiger's side armor to be certain." Müller considered this for a moment before nodding. "Very well, we have Eike's damaged Tiger from last week's engagement. We'll use that." 20 minutes later, they had repositioned around the damaged Tiger, which sat majestically despite its broken transmission. Its massive bulk dwarfed the Panther they had just tested. This was the pride of German armored forces, a machine that had become a legend and a symbol of fear for Allied tankers and infantry alike. Brandt loaded another captured rocket and took position. The men watched with greater interest now, their previous dismissiveness replaced by professional curiosity. When the rocket struck the Tiger's side armor, the impact seemed less impressive than before, but when they examined the results, a troubling discovery awaited them. 30 millimeters penetration, Müller announced after measuring the hole. Not enough to penetrate completely, but enough to severely damage internal components, Brandt finished. A hit in the right place could disable the tank, if not destroy it completely. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Schmidt's face had grown more serious. "How many of these weapons do intelligence reports say the Americans have deployed?" Brandt consulted a notebook he carried. "According to manufacturing estimates, approximately 170,000 bazookas have been produced since 1942. They're standard issue to infantry squads." The significance of this number hung in the air. Every German officer present understood what it meant. Virtually every American infantry unit they would face could potentially damage or disable their tanks. Müller cleared his throat. "Let's continue the tests. We need to understand the effective range and accuracy of these weapons. Weber, your platoon will conduct further trials this afternoon. I want a complete report by evening." As the officers dispersed to continue their duties, Brandt remained behind with Müller. "There's something else in the intelligence reports that concerns me," he said quietly. "What is it?" "The Americans are already fielding an improved version. They call it the M9 bazooka. It has a larger rocket and improved penetration characteristics." Müller absorbed this information with a frown. "Keep that to yourself for now. We need more information before we alarm the men." Later that afternoon, in a clearing 2 kilometers from the morning's demonstration site, Untersturmführer Weber supervised a more comprehensive testing program. 5 of his men had been taught the basics of operating the captured bazookas, and they were now firing at various targets at different ranges. "Try 150 meters, Weber instructed a young tank loader named Fischer, who had shown a natural aptitude for the American weapon. Fischer took aim at an abandoned French truck they had positioned as a target. The rocket launch was loud in the forest clearing, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. The rocket missed the truck by several meters, impacting a tree behind it. "Accuracy dropped significantly beyond 120 meters, Weber noted, writing in his field book. "But within that range." His voice trailed off as Fischer loaded another rocket and fired at a closer target, an old armored car at 70 meters. The rocket struck precisely where aimed and blasted a hole through both sides of the vehicle. "Within effective range, even an inexperienced operator can hit a tank-sized target," Weber finished, looking troubled. As the testing continued, a motorcycle courier arrived with a message for Weber. He read it quickly. "Command wants an immediate report on the bazooka's effectiveness against our Schürzen side skirts." The Schürzen were armored skirts that had been added to many German tanks specifically to counter Soviet anti-tank rifles. They created a standoff distance that caused shaped charge weapons to detonate before reaching the main armor. "We'll test that next," Weber decided. They retrieved several Schutzen panels from maintenance stores and set them up at varying distances from a simulated tank hull. The results were mixed but concerning. While the skirts did reduce penetration when properly spaced, they didn't eliminate the threat entirely. As evening approached, Weber, Brandt and Müller gathered in the company command post, a farmhouse requisitioned for their use. Maps covered the walls, and radio operators maintained contact with battalion headquarters from an adjacent room. "So what are we facing?" Müller asked once they were alone. Weber consulted his notes. "The bazooka is effective against our armor at ranges up to 120 meters. Beyond that, accuracy becomes the limiting factor. The Schutzen provide some protection, but not complete immunity." "And they're in the hands of standard infantry," Müller pressed. Brandt nodded. "According to our intelligence, each American infantry squad has at least one bazooka team. That means every company we face might have 12 to 15 bazookas." The implications settled heavily on the three officers. For years, German tanks had operated with near impunity against infantry. The psychological advantage had been enormous. Tank crews could advance confidently, knowing that without anti-tank guns or artillery, enemy infantry posed little threat. That calculus had now fundamentally changed. "We need to adjust our tactics," Müller decided. "Effective immediately. All tanks will operate with infantry support whenever possible. No tank is to advance into areas where infantry might be concealed in buildings or woods without reconnaissance." "The men won't like it," Weber observed. "They're accustomed to being the hunters, not the hunted." "They'll like being burned alive inside their tanks even less," Brandt said bluntly. "We should also adjust our formation spacing and movement patterns. Predictable tank columns are perfect targets for ambush." Müller nodded in agreement. "Draft new tactical guidelines tonight. We'll distribute them to all commanders tomorrow." The following morning, Müller called a meeting of all tank commanders in his company. The mood was tense as he explained what they had learned about the American bazooka and outlined the new tactical guidelines. "This changes nothing about our superiority on the battlefield," he assured them, though he didn't entirely believe his own words. "Our tanks remain the most powerful in the world. We simply need to be more cautious about infantry ambushes." Schmidt raised a hand. "What about our fuel situation? Wider spacing means more radio communication and more complicated logistics." It was a valid concern. Fuel shortages had already been hampering German operations. The tactical changes would only increase consumption. "We adapt or we die," Müller stated simply. "Battalion has approved the new guidelines." As the meeting broke up, Unterscharführer Franz Keller, one of the younger tank commanders, approached Müller privately. "Is it true what they're saying? That every American infantryman can kill our Tigers now?" Müller chose his words carefully. "Not every infantryman, no, but their bazooka teams are a threat we must respect." "Don't let the crew hear you speaking this way. Confidence is essential." Keller nodded, but the worry remained in his eyes as he left. 2 days later, the theoretical became practical. American forces launched an attack along a 3-kilometer front, attempting to break through German defenses south of St. Lo. Müller's company was ordered to counterattack and restore the line. As the tanks moved out from their concealed positions, Müller stood in the commander's cupola of his Tiger, scanning the terrain ahead through binoculars. The landscape was a patchwork of small fields divided by the distinctive Norman hedgerows, earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that had already proven to be perfect defensive positions. "All tanks maintain spacing. Hold at least 50 meters between vehicles," he ordered over the radio. "Advance to phase line Anton and hold for infantry to catch up." The Tigers and Panthers moved ponderously across the fields, their engines roaring. From his elevated position, Müller could see American artillery beginning to range in on their position. "Gunner, 2 o'clock American position in the hedgerow. High explosive," he ordered. His Tiger's massive gun elevated slightly, then fired with a thunderous boom. The hedgerow erupted in dirt and smoke. "Target destroyed. Advance continuing," Müller reported. The attack proceeded according to plan for the first 1,000 meters. Then, as they approached a small cluster of farm buildings, everything changed. "Contact right," came a sudden shout over the radio from Schmidt's tank. "Infantry with bazookas!" Miller swiveled his cupola just in time to see a streak of smoke arc toward Schmidt's Panther. The rocket struck the turret junction, a vulnerable point where the turret met the hull. Almost immediately, smoke began pouring from the hatches. "Schmidt, report," Miller called urgently. There was no response for several agonizing seconds. Then Schmidt's voice, shaken but alive. "Penetration in the turret ring, fire in the fighting compartment, we're bailing out." Miller watched as Schmidt and 3 of his crew emerged from the hatches, scrambling down the sides of their tank as flames began to lick from the open commander's cupola. The driver didn't appear. "All tanks, adjust formation. Focus fire on that farmhouse, all weapons," Miller ordered. The German tanks opened fire with main guns and machine guns, shredding the stone buildings. But as they concentrated on that threat, another emerged. "Contact left. More infantry, multiple positions," called Weber's voice. Miller felt a cold dread as he realized they had driven into a prepared ambush. American infantry had concealed themselves in the hedgerows on both sides of their approach, waiting until the German tanks were fully committed before revealing themselves. "Reverse! Get back to the tree line," Miller ordered. As his driver began to back the massive Tiger, Miller saw more smoke trails in the air. One rocket missed Keller's tank by meters. Another struck a Panther commanded by Untersturmführer Hoffmann, but detonated against the Schützenskirts without penetrating. Then Müller saw something that made his blood run cold. An American soldier, barely visible in the hedgerow, rising with a bazooka on his shoulder, aiming directly at Müller's tank. The distance was no more than 60 meters. "Driver, hard left," Müller shouted down into the tank. The Tiger lurched as the driver responded, but not quickly enough. Müller felt rather than heard the impact as the rocket struck the side of the turret. Inside the tank, the sound was deafening, followed by a shower of sparks and metal fragments as the shaped charge penetrated the armor. "Fire in the radio compartment," yelled the gunner. Smoke began filling the fighting compartment. Müller knew they had only seconds before the ammunition could ignite. "Everyone out! Abandon tank!" he ordered. The crew needed no encouragement. They scrambled from their positions toward the hatches. Müller was the last out, pausing only to grab the code books before climbing through his cupola and jumping to the ground. They ran for the cover of a nearby ditch as their Tiger, the pride of German armor, burned behind them. From the relative safety of the ditch, Müller watched as the German counterattack disintegrated. Of the 12 tanks that had begun the advance, 5 were now burning on the field. The others were in retreat, firing as they withdrew. An hour later, what remained of the company had regrouped at their starting positions. The mood was somber as tank commanders reported their losses. 7 tanks destroyed, 6 more damaged, 11 crewmen dead, 16 wounded. In the command post that evening, Müller sat with Brandt and the other surviving officers, attempting to make sense of the disaster. "They were waiting for us," Weber said, his face streaked with soot from helping to extinguish a fire in his tank. They knew exactly where to position their bazooka teams for maximum effect. Brandt spread a map on the table. They placed teams on both sides of the approach route, covering each other. When we focused fire on one position, we exposed our vulnerable side armor to the others. "It's a tactic they've clearly practiced," Müller acknowledged, "and one we need to counter." A junior officer named Lehmann, recently arrived from the Eastern Front, spoke up. "On the Russian front, we've learned never to advance without infantry screens. The Russians have anti-tank rifles that can't penetrate our frontal armor, but can damage tracks and wheels. These bazookas are much worse." "The problem is manpower," Müller responded. "We don't have enough infantry to properly screen our movements, and those we have aren't always well coordinated with our units." "Then we need to change how we think about tanks entirely," Brandt suggested. "They're no longer invulnerable fortress weapons that can operate independently. They're vulnerable to infantry now in ways they never were before." This statement hung in the air. For years, the Panzer forces had been the elite of the German military, spearheading advances across Europe. The psychological effect of their apparent invincibility had been as important as their actual combat power. That aura was now shattered. "What do we tell the men?" Weber asked the question they were all considering. The truth, Müller decided, that we face a new threat requiring new tactics, that our technical superiority remains, but we must be smarter in how we deploy it. The following day, Müller gathered his surviving tank crews for a frank discussion. Standing before a map board with the previous day's battlefield marked, he explained the situation without sugarcoating it. "Yesterday we learned an expensive lesson," he began. "The Americans have successfully deployed a weapon that gives their infantry a credible anti-tank capability. This is not cause for alarm, but for adaptation." He outlined a series of tactical changes, never advancing without infantry support, maintaining better dispersion between vehicles, using smoke more liberally to mask movements, and, most importantly, never presenting side armor to potential infantry positions. "Our tanks remain superior to anything the Americans field," he assured them. "Their Sherman tanks are no match for our Tigers and Panthers, but we must recognize that the battlefield has changed. Every hedgerow, every building, every patch of woods might now conceal a weapon capable of killing our tanks." The men listened soberly. Many had lost friends the previous day. The invincibility they had felt inside their armored beasts had been pierced as surely as their tank's armor. After the briefing, Müller found Keller checking the repairs on his tank. The young commander had escaped the ambush unscathed, but the experience had clearly shaken him. "How are you holding up?" Müller asked. Keller looked up from inspecting a new track link being installed. "I keep thinking about how close that rocket came. Another meter to the left and I'd be dead." "That's the reality of war," Müller said. "We've been fortunate until now. Our tanks gave us protection few soldiers enjoy, but there has never been an invulnerable weapon." "It's not just the bazookas," Keller admitted. "It's everything. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, air attacks. Sometimes it feels like we're fighting the entire world with one hand tied behind our backs." Müller couldn't argue with this assessment. The strategic situation for Germany had been deteriorating for months. The bazooka was just one more challenge in a war that seemed increasingly unwinnable. "We fight with what we have," Müller said simply, "and we adapt. The Americans have their bazookas, but we still have the best tanks and the best crews." Keller nodded, appearing somewhat reassured. "We'll be ready for them next time." Over the next weeks, Müller's company put their new tactics into practice. They operated more cautiously, with better infantry coordination when possible. They used terrain more effectively, avoiding situations where they might be ambushed. Losses decreased, though they never stopped entirely. In early August, an intelligence officer visited their position, bringing with him captured examples of the newer M9 bazooka that Brandt had mentioned. This version had a larger rocket and improved sights. Tests showed it could penetrate even more armor than its predecessor. "They're manufacturing thousands of these every month," the intelligence officer explained, "and they're shipping them not just to their own forces, but to partisans and resistance fighters across occupied Europe." This news sent a ripple of concern through the officer corps. The implication was clear. Soon they would face these weapons not just at the front, but in rear areas as well. During this period, Müller began keeping a journal, recording his observations and thoughts about the changing nature of armored warfare. On August 12th, he wrote, "The mystique of the Tiger has been our greatest weapon. When American or British troops saw our tanks approaching, many would simply flee rather than fight. That psychological advantage is now fading. They've armed themselves with weapons that give individual soldiers the courage to stand and fight. A man with a bazooka believes he can kill a tiger, and that belief makes him dangerous in ways that are difficult to counter." 2 days later, he added another observation. "Production numbers tell the true story of this war. We have approximately 250 operational Tigers on the Western Front. Intelligence estimates the Americans have deployed over 170,000 bazookas. This means for every Tiger we field, they have weapons to destroy it 600 times over. How does one fight such overwhelming numerical superiority?" By mid-August, the situation in Normandy had become critical for German forces. American and British armies had broken through at multiple points, and a general withdrawal was being planned. Müller's company, now reduced to 7 operational tanks, was assigned to a rearguard action covering the retreat of an infantry division. On August 17th, they took up positions on a ridge overlooking a key crossroads. Their orders were to hold for 12 hours, allowing the infantry to withdraw in good order. From his position, Müller could see American columns advancing in the distance, tanks and infantry moving together in a display of the combined arms tactics that had become increasingly effective. "They're learning," Brandt observed as he stood beside Müller's tank, both men scanning the horizon with binoculars. 6 months ago they would have sent their tanks forward alone. "And we would have destroyed them," Müller agreed. "Now they advance with infantry, artillery, and air support all coordinated." As they watched, American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers roared overhead, strafing German positions further along the ridge. The message was clear: no place was safe from Allied air power. "It won't be long now," Brandt said quietly. "They'll be within range within the hour." Müller nodded. "We hold as ordered. 12 hours, then we withdraw to the new defensive line." As Brandt returned to his tank, Müller found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that demonstration just weeks ago. The confident officers who had laughed at the American toy were gone, replaced by battle-hardened veterans who respected every threat the enemy posed. The expected American attack began at 1400 hours, artillery first, then tanks and infantry advancing in bounds. Müller's remaining tanks held their fire until the Americans were within killing range, then opened up with devastating effect. 3 Sherman tanks erupted in flames within the first minutes, but the Americans kept coming, and now they were using their own lessons learned. Their infantry spread out, using every fold in the ground for cover, working their way forward with bazookas ready. "Watch the left flank," Müller warned over the radio. "They're trying to work around to our side armor." For 3 hours they held the position, destroying several more Shermans and inflicting heavy casualties on the American infantry. But the pressure was relentless. American artillery pounded their positions, and their air superiority meant German tanks had to remain under tree cover whenever possible. At 1700 hours, Müller received a radio message from division headquarters. "All units withdraw immediately to line Siegfried. Repeat, withdraw immediately." Something had gone wrong elsewhere on the front. The orderly withdrawal had become a retreat. "All tanks, begin withdrawal by echelon," Müller ordered. "Second platoon first, then headquarters, then first platoon." As the first tanks began to pull back, American artillery increased its intensity. Shells exploded around Müller's position, showering his tank with dirt and shrapnel. Then came a new sound, the distinctive roar of American tank engines coming from the east. Müller swiveled his cupola and felt a chill. A column of Shermans had somehow worked around their flank and was now threatening to cut off their retreat. "Change of plans," he called urgently over the radio. "All tanks withdraw immediately along Route Baker. Americans on our eastern flank." As his driver pivoted the Tiger, Müller saw movement in the tree line to their south. American infantry had worked their way to within 100 meters of their position. "Gunner, tree line, high explosive," he ordered. The gun fired, shell impacting among the trees, but it was too late. Multiple rocket trails streaked from the foliage toward the German tanks. Keller's tank, just 20 meters from Müller's, took a direct hit to its engine compartment. Black smoke billowed immediately, and flames licked along the rear deck. "Keller's hit," Weber reported unnecessarily. Müller watched as Keller and his crew abandoned their burning vehicle. They ran toward Müller's tank, seeking the protection of its bulk. "Get them aboard," Müller ordered his loader, who opened the hatch to help the crewmen climb on. As they began to withdraw, more rockets flew from the tree line. One struck the ground near Müller's track, exploding harmlessly. Another hit Weber's tank in the turret, but at an angle that caused it to ricochet without penetrating. The retreat became a fighting withdrawal, with the remaining German tanks firing as they pulled back. American Shermans pursued cautiously, respecting the superior firepower of the German vehicles. By nightfall, what remained of Müller's company had reached the new defensive line. Of the 7 tanks that had begun the day, only 4 remained operational. Keller's had been destroyed, Weber's damaged beyond immediate repair, and Lehmann's had thrown a track during the withdrawal and had to be abandoned. In the command bunker that night, Müller submitted his report to the battalion commander, a Major Richter who had arrived from Germany just 2 weeks earlier. So the Americans have weapons that can penetrate our heaviest tanks, and they've distributed them to regular infantry units, Richter summarized after reading the report. Yes, sir, Miller confirmed. We've adjusted our tactics accordingly. But the fundamental balance has shifted. Our tanks are no longer impervious to infantry. Richter was silent for a moment. What would you recommend, Obersturmführer? You've faced these weapons in combat. Miller chose his words carefully. We need better infantry coordination, more fuel for more dispersed operations, and improved reconnaissance. But most importantly, we need to recognize that the days of tanks operating independently are over. The Americans have democratized anti-tank warfare. Democratized, Richter repeated with a grim smile, an apt choice of words. The following week saw further withdrawals as Allied forces continued to advance. Müller's company received replacement tanks and crews, but the new crews lacked experience, and the replacement tanks often had mechanical issues, reflecting the deteriorating quality of German manufacturing as the war progressed. On August 25th, Müller was called to battalion headquarters. He found Major Richter studying a large map with several other officers. "Ah, Müller," Richter greeted him. "We've received new intelligence about American anti-tank capabilities that confirms your observations. Come see this." He led Müller to a table where reconnaissance photographs were spread out. They showed American troops training with bazookas behind their lines. "These were taken 3 days ago," Richter explained. "Note how they're practicing against moving targets, specifically training to hit vulnerable points." Müller studied the photographs with professional interest. "They're getting better. Their initial bazooka teams were often poorly trained, firing at suboptimal angles. These look more sophisticated." "And there's more," Richter added, handing Müller a translated American training document. "They're now teaching infantry to work in coordinated anti-tank teams. One group suppresses the tank's vision blocks with small arms fire, while others maneuver with bazookas to attack from the flanks or rear." Müller read through the document with growing concern. This is essentially what the Russians have been doing with their anti-tank rifles, but with much more effective weapons. "Exactly," Richter confirmed. "And intelligence believes they'll soon be fielding even more advanced weapons, something called a recoilless rifle, with even greater penetration capabilities." This news settled heavily on Müller. The technological advantage that German armor had enjoyed for so long was eroding rapidly. "What are your orders, sir?" he asked finally. "Continue the withdrawal to the Seine. Your company will cover the crossing points. After that, we'll likely withdraw all the way to the Siegfried Line." The retreat that followed was orderly but relentless. Day after day, Müller's tanks engaged in rearguard actions, holding positions long enough for infantry and artillery to withdraw, then falling back themselves. They destroyed many American tanks and vehicles, but for everyone they knocked out, more appeared. And always there were the bazooka teams. They became increasingly bold and effective, striking from unexpected positions, working in coordinated groups that made them difficult to counter. German losses mounted despite their tactical adjustments. By early September, as they approached the German border, Müller's original company had been essentially destroyed and rebuilt twice over. Of the officers who had witnessed that first bazooka demonstration in July, only Müller himself and Brandt remained. On September 7th, as they established defensive positions near the Belgian border, Brandt found Müller studying maps in the company command post. "I've been thinking about that day we tested the bazookas," Brandt said without preamble. Müller looked up. "What about it?" "We were so confident, so certain of our superiority, and in many ways we were right. Our tanks are better designed, better armored, with better guns. But none of that matters if every enemy soldier can destroy them." Müller nodded slowly. "The Americans understood something we didn't. That quality can be overwhelmed by quantity if the quantity is distributed widely enough. It's not just military doctrine," Brandt continued. "It's philosophy. We created weapons for an elite few, operated by specially trained crews. They created simpler weapons that any soldier could use effectively after minimal training, and manufactured them by the hundreds of thousands," Müller added. They were silent for a moment, both contemplating the broader implications. "What happens when we reach Germany?" Brandt asked eventually. Müller had been wondering the same thing. We fight on more favorable terrain with shorter supply lines, but the fundamental equation doesn't change. They still have more of everything: tanks, planes, artillery, and yes, bazookas. And we're running out of fuel, spare parts, and trained crews, Brandt noted. There was no arguing with this assessment. Both men knew the strategic situation was dire. The following day, Müller received orders to report to division headquarters. There, he was surprised to find himself ushered into a meeting with a general from the High Command who had come to inspect the front. Obersturmführer Müller, the general greeted him. I've read your reports on American anti-tank capabilities. Very thorough. Tell me, in your professional opinion, what do we need to counter this threat effectively? Müller considered his response carefully. Sir, the threat posed by widely distributed anti-tank weapons requires a fundamental reconsideration of armored doctrine. We need more infantry support, better reconnaissance, and most importantly, we need to accept that our tanks are no longer invulnerable to infantry and adjust our tactics accordingly. The general nodded. And if you were to design a new tank to meet these threats, more side armor would help, but would reduce mobility and increase fuel consumption, Müller answered honestly. Better machine guns for anti-infantry defense, perhaps. But the truth is, sir, no practical tank design can be made invulnerable to determined infantry with shaped charge weapons. The general's expression was unreadable. Thank you for your candor, Obersturmführer. That will be all. As Müller left the headquarters, he wondered if his frankness would have consequences. But he had spoken the truth as he understood it. The nature of armored warfare had changed fundamentally, and no amount of wishful thinking would change it back. In the months that followed, as German forces retreated to and then within their own borders, Müller's observations proved prophetic. American bazooka teams became increasingly effective, working in concert with tanks, artillery, and air power to steadily erode German defenses. By December 1944, what remained of Müller's company was defending a sector of the Siegfried Line. Their tanks, once the spearhead of German offensives, were now essentially mobile pillboxes, dug into defensive positions with only their turrets exposed. On Christmas Eve, Müller found himself sharing a bottle of schnapps with Brandt in a bunker that served as their command post. Outside, snow fell gently, creating a deceptive peace over the battlefield. Do you remember what Schmidt said that day? Brandt asked, his voice slightly slurred from the alcohol. When we first saw the bazookas, he asked if every American farm boy thought he could be a tank killer. Müller nodded. And now we know the answer. They democratized tank killing, Brandt said, echoing Müller's words from months earlier. Any infantry soldier with basic training can now threaten the most advanced tank. It's a revolution in warfare. A revolution we were slow to recognize, Müller acknowledged. Both men were silent, contemplating how much had changed, not just in tactical reality, but in their own understanding of modern warfare. What happens after the war? Brandt asked eventually. To tanks, I mean. Müller considered this. They'll evolve. More armor, better weapons, improved mobility. But the fundamental calculus has changed forever. Infantry will always have weapons that can threaten tanks, and those weapons will become more effective, not less. The age of tank supremacy was brief, Brandt observed, barely 20 years from the first effective tanks to the weapons that democratized their destruction. Perhaps that's the nature of warfare, Müller suggested. Every technological advantage is temporary. The only constant is adaptation. As they spoke, an American artillery barrage began in the distance, a reminder that the war continued despite the holiday. Both men knew what likely awaited them in the coming year: further retreats, more losses, and eventually defeat. Yet in that moment, sharing drinks as professional soldiers, they found a certain peace in understanding the historical forces they had witnessed. They had seen a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare, a democratization of lethality that would shape conflicts for generations to come. In the decades that followed, Müller's predictions proved accurate. Tanks evolved to become more heavily armored, better armed, and more sophisticated. But they never regained the aura of invincibility they had once possessed. Infantry anti-tank weapons evolved as well, maintaining the balance that had been established when ordinary American soldiers first carried bazookas into battle against German Tigers. The lesson learned by those SS Panzer crews in the summer of 1944, echoed through military doctrine for decades. No weapon system, however advanced, remains superior forever. The democratization of tank killing was just one example of a pattern that would repeat throughout military history. The constant cycle of measure and countermeasure, advantage and adaptation. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.